Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Stephen Falgout.
And I am your other host, Louis Falgu. Get Recc'd is our occasionally bi-weekly podcast where at the end of each episode I recommend some piece of media to Stephen and Stephen recommends some piece of media to me, and then we come back the next week or the next episode to talk about those recommendations.
We have some good recs to talk about today, but I just wanted to chime in because it is the middle of September 2019, and 2019 is just flying by.
Yeah.
We're about to all have clear, crystal clear vision. Louis, I'm planning to throw a Gatsby party at the end of the year to really ring in the Roaring 20s. What are you going to do to ring in the Roaring 20s?
Well,
Are you going to prepare to be greatly depressed?
yeah, greatly.
I think everyone should be prepared to be greatly depressed. We're going to have a kicking year in the first year.
You might, yeah.
Maybe even through the first 7 years. But then it's all going to come crashing down again.
Yeah, so just
I've
keep
got
that in mind,
my,
everyone. That's our warning to... Well, this is only our warning to Americans. Let's be very clear.
Yeah, I've got my newsy cap ready. I'm ready to get up on the street, take down the stock market. But before that, I'm going to have some wild parties.
Yeah. Yeah, Steven's going to take down the stock market single-handedly, so you'll know who to blame.
Yeah. I mean, don't blame me, but you'll know.
Yeah. It'll be our little secret, our little Get Recc'd secret, okay? There's so few people that are going to hear this secret today. I'm sure it won't get out. So don't
all
worry
of our
about it.
millions of listeners right now, don't tell anybody.
Mm-hmm. You'll feel
And
real
again,
fucking cool when it comes out in the history books like 50 years later and everyone will be like, we didn't know, but you knew.
Yeah. Yeah, there'll be the big unraveling. They'll finally be able to pin it on one person. I'll still be alive, obviously, and they'll be like, hey, it was you. And I'll be like, maybe. But everyone else will be like, nah, it was definitely him, but we're still not going to say anything.
Yeah. It's okay. I'm sure they'll never catch you, Steven.
All of our millions of listeners are going to be on the jury. They're going to be in the trial, but they'll be like, nah, he probably didn't do it.
Yeah. Well, that's just what happens when you're a great host. You know, everybody just loves you so much they let you get away with destroying an economy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And again, can't stress this enough, only the U.S. Everyone else, you do whatever you want, I guess.
Yeah, your 20s will not be roaring. They will not be.
No.
But they might be okay.
They might be like, they might be like a little jovial.
Yeah,
I'm
maybe.
hoping.
Yeah.
But not necessarily roaring.
Yeah. Well, speaking of roaring, I don't know how that relates to this, but maybe it does somehow. Would we like to get into what I recommended to you last week, or last time, Stephen?
Yes.
Okay, well, last episode, I recommended to Stephen the EP Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites by the ever-lovable Skrillex, who you can see there looking very, very nice, very cute. I'll just let you go, Stephen. What did you think?
He might delete that later. Looking cute now, but might delete later. Louis, I don't know how I'm going to talk about this one. So I want to start with, can we talk about what is a bro step? Because that's what Wikipedia says this thing is. Bro step.
Well, I'm not an electronic music connoisseur, so, but to my understanding, because I have listened to Burial, who's considered a dubstep artist, and I have heard like bits and pieces of like old school dubstep, basically before the 2010s, before everybody knew what it was, and it really wasn't like this at all. It was like really chilled out, kind of like nocturnal music, lo-fi hip-hop beats to relax and study to, if you will, with like really subtle kind of bass wubbing in the background. So like people like Skrillex, namely Skrillex, took that and somehow turned it into the sample in the beginning, pretty sample, epic bass drop, and then loud wubbing. So basically, bro step is what you know of as dubstep, but it's not actually dubstep.
Now, I feel like I remember hearing at some point that dubstep, or the evolution of dubstep, mainly came out of the UK.
Yes, it was like, I think the two genres that it was mixing were two-step and dub. I'm pretty sure that's how it got the name, because it was dub and two-step. Somebody could correct me. It might be some other dub thing, maybe not like dub, because dub is like reggae. I don't know, but it's something like that. Yeah, it came out of the UK garage scene, I believe. Yeah.
And I'm also guessing that Bear Noise and Foreign Beggars are from the UK.
I have no idea. Probably, I don't know.
Can we also talk about, again, I'll get to the album in a second here, or the EP, but can we also talk about at what point is something a remix and at what point is something just something completely different? Because I will tell you, I want to say it's Zed's remix. No. I don't know whose remix of Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites it was, because there are two on the EP. But one of them didn't really sound like the song, like didn't even feel like it had any elements of the song anymore.
I think it was Zed. I've only heard the remixes once. I think it was the Zed one, though. That sounds about right.
Yeah, because I was like, why is this a remix? I don't even think it's the thing anymore. I mean, I guess if you think about a remix, at some point, if you remix something hard enough, it's still a remix. It's just not the thing.
Yeah.
So he remixed it so hard that he made it into a different song. So props to Zed, you know?
Props to Zed.
Yeah, he really earned the second D on his name, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so the EP itself. Again, I think I mentioned at the top, I don't really know how I'm going to talk about this thing, because I don't know how to really evaluate it. I don't feel like I'm well-versed enough. One, in music in general, if anyone listening has noticed over the course of our 36 episodes here, but two, in whatever you would call this electro stuff that Skrillex is laying down here. I've heard Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites before. That one is the title track, and also probably the only thing here that peaked on the charts. But I guess the way I'll talk about it is I feel like there is a progression here in the EP, which is interesting, although probably most well known for the drops and the sampling Skrillex is. But even if you go from track 1 to track 6, and then it gets into some remixes, there is kind of a progression of build up even within the track. There are a couple of tracks here that I feel like are a little slower, a little more methodical, like all I Ask of You, that has a feature on it, and then the final track, With You Friends. Again, I'm calling it the final track, but there are technically 3 more tracks. They're just remixes.
Yeah.
And I would say, like, the most hard that this thing goes is Kill Everybody, and then also in Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites. But as far as like electric or electronic music, I feel like there are very distinct electronic tracks here. But then there are things that I would consider maybe more house, like All I Ask of You or With You Friends. So I thought that was interesting, because I was going into this expecting basically Bangarang over and over again.
Oh, thank God it wasn't that.
There was actually something interesting. There was some composition here that I feel like was thought out, which I found pretty engaging, honestly.
Yeah. I want to tell a story about some people here already kind of know it, but like about how I ended up listening to this, because Skrillex is a total joke. At least he's certainly treated that way, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, and I remember this era very clearly, because when I was a middle schooler and this was popular, I loved it for like, at least a year.
Yeah, can I make a comparison?
Yeah, go ahead.
Skrillex to me feels like the Linkin Park of its generation. Like, Linkin Park was very middle school cool,
Yeah.
and then it wasn't. And I feel like Skrillex was like the same thing, but for a different generation.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. But the thing is that, like, in that sense, definitely, yeah, you're right. Um, but what appealed to me about this going, and why I wanted to kind of return to it, was because I realized and I thought this was so funny at the time, and now I take it pretty seriously. Actually, I realized that like Skrillex is one of, I mean, by far the most influential artists of this decade. Like, and it's not just because he made dubstep, or bro step, but everyone calls it dubstep now. It's not just because he made dubstep super popular and mainstream, and like pop artists were integrating it. Wasn't it Taylor Swift who did that track with like dubstep in it?
Yeah, I just
Yeah.
I just wanna I have an anecdote. I went to a concert once, and it was like a medley of performers, and Train was one of the performers. And in the middle of Train's set, they had a dubstep breakdown. So I don't know if that puts it in perspective, but maybe that says more on Train than anything else. But I think that's a good reflection of like how influential he ended up being especially for the pop medium.
Yeah, and it's not even just like it's 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 not even just dubstep though. It's like, yeah, it is pop, and I think that even the EDM breakthrough in pop has Skrillex to thank for it. I mean, there were certainly other DJs who I think were the ones who start really hit pop and really made all those EDM sounds prevalent in pop. But I think you could definitely make the argument that artists like Skrillex and maybe Deadmau5 too, bubbled that up in the underground to the extent where the mainstream could really accept that in pop music. Because think about how many massive singles this decade, especially in the first half of this decade, but like even now, I think maybe not now, but even like just a couple years ago, were like EDM bangers, with like a really pretty singer in the beginning, and then like a drop. I mean, just the fact that pop music embraced the bass drop has like a lot of ties and to Skrillex, I think, and it's kind of nuts. And we were talking about, I saw somebody else make this comparison, so it's not my comparison. And it seems silly at first, but I think it actually makes some sense. I think even underground artists, like even maybe Sophie, who we talked about, or underground, not really underground, but who we talked about in another episode, like maybe actually do kind of have something to owe to Skrillex, in an odd way. Like, it's funny. Like, I don't think this is something that people want to admit. But when I went to this EP and I checked it out, is that like what really impresses me about this actually is I think this music. I'm talking about the first 3 tracks really. I'll get to like the latter 3, but the first 3 tracks, the main dubstep bangers here that everybody knew at the time. That's Rock and Roll, the title track, and Kill Everybody, are like, they're incredibly complex, like super layered. The sound design here is completely insane. Like, samples will just fly in ear to ear. There's crazy panning work. The bass growls actually like sound fucking crazy. I have no idea how he made them. And just in general, like the production work on this is extremely impressive. And that like really caught me off guard, because when I think of some of the Skrillex songs that I knew after this point that I did go back and re-listen to, like Bangarang, for example, it's shocking how much he degraded. Because listening to that stuff, it's kind of more to the basics of this, and the basics of this just isn't very interesting. There's a very distinct formula here. You get the pretty sample in the beginning, you have an epic bass drop with a sample, and then the wub wub wubbing or whatever. And it's like, when that's all you have, which is what so many of the artists who I think were influenced by Skrillex ended up giving, was just that and nothing else. It's just really, really formulaic, really predictable, and really bad. But I really think that when this EP's bro step, dubstep tracks, whatever you want to call them, actually show an incredible amount of finesse.
Yeah, and I think to this same point, essentially what happened was, I don't know if even he was expecting the amount of press that this thing got, and the amount of popularity that this thing got, and as a function of that, a lot of his later stuff feels very much more radio friendly. Toned back, so that way you can play it on the radio and it can get those sweet hits.
Yeah.
Can I just mention that the Wikipedia article, and this is a cited source from a journal, has noted that Scary Monsters and Night Sprites has been somewhat proven to be a female mosquito repellent. So if you were wondering,
Yeah, I've seen articles about that.
you were wondering about that.
Yeah.
That gets a 10 out of 10 from me, dog.
Yeah. I don't know. It's just and let's actually take that track because that was the biggest track off of this, from what I remember. Like the song "Scary Monsters and Night Sprites" just blew the gates open on this kind of music, and made it like a huge fad for like at least 3 years, maybe just 3 years. But again, I feel like remnants still continue to this day. And when you listen to that song, I when I was going back to this, I was expecting to have a laugh, right? Like I didn't take this seriously. Nobody takes this seriously, what's amazing, like, I think this song works within the formula that Skrillex has set up here. And the formula for these songs is pretty obvious, and very easy to predict. But, like, it really just does everything right. Like, the verses are genuinely beautiful. Like, the sampling work is, the vocal sampling is incredible. And the melody that's created on it is actually really kind of otherworldly. It's really cool. And then, of course, you've got the epic bass drop with a really memorable sample. But the actual the actual section where it gets into the growls, it constantly contrasts these like ugly and disgusting and deep sounds and then immediately meshes them back up against the pretty stuff you heard in the beginning. And it's like, again, it's an obvious formula, but I feel like this track demonstrates how that actually can work really well if the artist is like really considering contrast, and also the element of surprise too. Like, that's what I think makes this song really work. I also want to call out "Rock and Roll," which is my favorite song here, because it honestly kind of blows my mind. I can't believe I'm saying that, but it honestly kind of blows my mind just how good the sampling work is on this track. When it gets into the hook of the song, especially when the wubs are kind of contrasted up against the sampling, it's just insane. Like, I don't know. It impresses me. Skrillex impresses me. You heard it here.
And while not necessarily deep, some of these tracks have at least something to say, especially with, it's pretty obviously and in your face. At the very end of "Rock and Roll," there's kind of a sample of what I'm guessing is an interview, either real or fake, about how essentially electronic music artists aren't real artists because they can't play an instrument.
Yeah.
So there's some fun little things like that. And obviously some of it I think is played for laughs, right? Like, as you mentioned, the Scary Monsters and Night Sprites sample of the kid going, "Oh my God." Like, yeah. And that still pops up to this day, that sample. So there's a little bit of humor here too, which I think is not overplayed. Kind of just enough to like not take itself too seriously, which I appreciated too.
Yeah, because I think especially nowadays, this sounds pretty goofy, right? Like, and again, a lot of that is maybe just because it became a meme. It became like a shitposty, ironic dubstep kind of thing, especially like once MLG memes became a thing, however long ago that was. Must have been forever ago. But even to this day, like, I feel like this era gets kind of memed on. But it seems like, it does seem like he had a sense of humor about it. Like, the "Kill Everybody" sample, the vocal clip there is just so goddamn stupid. Like, he had to know. That wasn't placed in there to be badass. It was silly, but it was fun. And yeah, you can't say it's deep. I guess it's just the sonic work here is what really surprised me about this, I guess. But do you have anything else to say about the first 3 tracks? Because I wanted to talk about the second half of this as well.
Nope.
Okay, yeah, so let's get into that, because you mentioned how the EP kind of changes styles towards the second half. I mean, there's Scata, which is still definitely like a dubstep track with the wubbing and everything, although it's like mixed with hip-hop. Kind of odd. But like, there's also "All I Ask of You," which just sounds like a typical, probably house. EDM genres are fucking weird. I think it's like a house track, with, I don't remember the singer's name, but just the singer over it. It's basically just like a song that's produced by an EDM producer. There's no like epic bass drop kind of stuff there. And then With You Friends is essentially like the pretty vocal sampling stuff from the beginning of Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites, but like just that for an entire track. So there is variety here, but to me, and I'll see what you think. But
Yeah, that's why I feel like it gets some of these tracks get a little more into the house category.
yeah, yeah, it seems like it. For me, I don't know about you. I guess we'll see. But like, I feel like the EP really falls off in the second half here. I like With You Friends. I think is pretty like nostalgic. It creates a pretty cool vibe. And Scada is an interesting idea, is the best I can say. All I Ask of You, though, just sounds really fucking bland. But I feel like a lot of what made the first half of this EP so special to me gets lost in all of these three tracks. Like, I don't think any of these three tracks are particularly impressive production-wise. I mean, they're fine, but they just feel serviceable to me. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I agree. And then even when you get to the remixes, I basically don't even remember them. So
Oh yeah, I cut them out because I treated them like bonus tracks. But they're just, I heard those once, and it's just like, I think that's just kind of a product of the genre. That's just kind of what producers do, is they include remixes on their stuff. I don't know. I don't care. It doesn't matter.
But the other thing is, except for Scada, All I've Asked of You and With You Friends, the other reason why I think those get more into the house category is I feel like they're overlong. I mean, All I Ask of You is like almost 6 minutes, and I think With You Friends is over 6 minutes.
Yeah.
And you feel it.
Yeah, it's like the kind of music you designed to play in a club, so it keeps going, so people can keep dancing and dropping acid or whatever. Or I guess that's a 90s thing. But
yeah, dropping dub.
Yeah. Dropping the bass.
Drop that bass.
But I think With You Friends is nice. All I Ask of You is the only real. I think that's the only track here that I think is just in the bad territory, because maybe it isn't as bad as some of this ultra generic pop songs like this that started to become really big, but it just kind of feels like those to me. It's just like, whatever. But I think the influence that came from this EP was definitely because of the songs in the first half anyway, right? Like, those first three tracks just sound like such an explosion, in a way, especially when you think about what they did end up doing for the industry. And Skrillex still works in the industry. I think he still produces for major pop artists and stuff. I don't know. He isn't really doing his own stuff anymore, it doesn't seem like. But yeah, I don't know. Listening to that stuff is cool. It seems like that influence was actually kind of earned. To me, anyway, it seems that way, yeah.
I think to me it feels like one of those things where, to put it in perspective, how influential and how big Skrillex got, he worked on the music for Wreck-It Ralph.
Did he really?
For the Disney film Wreck-It Ralph.
Nice.
So if that tells you anything.
Yeah. Well, this is gamer music, so yeah.
You mentioned Deadmau5, right? What's interesting is I feel like Deadmau5 paved the way for Skrillex, but I feel like not until Skrillex did Deadmau5 really become in the popular ethos, because Deadmau5 had been working with people for so long.
Yeah.
I mean, he had been kind of in the background for a very, very long time, working as a producer, working with that one guy in that band. I don't know if you remember that.
No, I don't know what you're referring to.
That one guy in that band, does that help?
Oh, yeah, that helps. Yeah, I got you.
Who's the guy who sings "Forget You" to censor it for our
CeeLo Green, right?
Audience? Green? He worked with CeeLo Green on in that band that they had together.
Oh.
So, but he was still kind of in the background. And then once Skrillex got as popular as he did, I feel like they both kind of helped each other progress into the modern ethos. And now as you mentioned it, pop songs even still right now, I feel like, are doing the bass drop thing. They're basically just like become just house nonsense. I don't know why.
Yeah.
But yeah, for the most part, I feel like as you mentioned, the first three tracks here are really interesting and engaging. I even like All I Ask of You. I think the reason why I talked about the history or asked about the history before is because I feel like Scada, they sound like they're from the UK, the two rappers, producers that are on that. And what's interesting about that is I feel like there's like kind of a handhold here, or a handshake here, that's like Skrillex working with London artists to bring dubstep out of the medium around the world. And I mean, this thing peaked not only in the UK but in charts around the world, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah. Are we ready to wrap it up?
Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
So I like this more than I thought I would. I think we talked about it before, but most of the tracks here I actually found pretty interesting. I thought that there was a well-constructed composition. The only thing is, it's like I have to, or I feel like I have to rate this EP as a full experience, and that experience includes those remixes because they're not listed as bonus tracks; they are listed as actual tracks, and I just don't care for them at all. And in some cases, I don't even feel like they're remixes. I just feel like it's kind of, he brought on some producers to make other songs, which is fine, but that generally brings down the watermark of this rating. So that's the only caveat I want to give. So I'm going to give this thing a 7. I think if I were to rate tracks 1 through 5 or 1 through 6 only, it would probably go up closer to an 8, but just that's my overall impression. But I would recommend this. I mean, I don't know if I'll ever listen to this again, or even if I'll continue to listen to Skrillex's later stuff. I already have listened to some of it, but for the most part, like, my listens through of this were, I thought it was a fun experience, actually.
Yeah.
And I did hardcore game while I was listening to it too.
Oh,
I was poning some news.
wait, please tell me you actually did. Please tell me you put this on while you were playing a game.
Oh, you know I did.
Oh, thank God. Yes, that's why you liked it. You see, it's gamer music.
It's gamer fuel, baby.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll second your thoughts. I mean, I don't know. I treat the remixes like bonus tracks. Maybe that's unfair.
Yeah, Gnarls Barkley, that's it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay. That's like okay. Crazy.
Thank you, Paris.
Yeah.
In the chat.
Right, yeah. So I'll second your thoughts. I do actually treat the remixes like bonus tracks. I think that's pretty fair to do that. So I'll take those off for my rating, but I'll give it the same rating, a 7. Because in my view, like, the first 3 tracks here are great. Rock and Roll in particular is my favorite. It's kind of amazing, that song. The other 2 are weaker. And again, I think this has aged, I would say. I mean, it definitely sounds goofier now than it did then. And maybe to some people then it just sounded goofy. But I was a kid, so it was like, whoa, you know. It's gotten hurt. But maybe that's not really the music's fault, and it's more just the way the internet treated it. I don't know. But whatever the case, again, I find that sound work just incredibly impressive. The production is pretty amazing. And the formula really works on these 3 tracks, I would say. I think after this point in the EP, when you get to the other 3 tracks, they're just not as good. To the point where when I think about this EP, I really just think about those first 3 tracks, because the other 3, they're fine. With You is a nice end to it, a nice closer. It's kind of a little bit of getting that emotion out, drawing out the gamer tears. But I don't know. It really does kind of fall off there. I think that everything that was so amazing about those first 3 tracks isn't quite as impressive in the next 3. But still, yes, I would recommend this, because I think people are very quick to mock this, sometimes for no reason. The reason is that it's gamer music, and that's about it. I think people have been very unfair to this. Maybe not unfair to Skrillex as a whole, because I will acknowledge that listening to later stuff after this, some of it is really garbage. But I think if you know bangeranging stuff and you just assume Skrillex is terrible because everybody tells you he is, I would say you should probably check this out. If for nothing else than to recognize and kind of hear an EP that was as influential as this is. And I guess you could say Bangering was too, but this really kickstarted it. And even if you don't like it, I think it's interesting for that reason to see, hey, wow, like, this weird dude who used to be in a metal band or something, like, made this whacked out crazy fucking music, and it somehow managed to make its way into the mainstream and still has remnants to this day. I think that's pretty cool. So yeah. Okay, we're ready to move on. Steven, you want to talk about what you recommended to me?
Yes. So, Lewis, last week I recommended to you the Netflix original series Stranger Things. Specifically, we'll be talking about the first season of Stranger Things. Stranger Things is a Netflix original made by the Duffer Brothers. Has a lot of influence on 80s films. Takes place in the 80s. Lewis, what did you think?
Okay, so I watched Stranger Things back when it came out. It was one of the only shows that was getting hyped that I actually cared enough to watch, and I don't remember why I did, but I did. And when I first watched this show, I thought it was spectacular. I mean, I hadn't been gripped by a show like this, maybe ever, and it really blew me away back at the time. So, when Steven wrecked it to me, I knew it would give me an opportunity to watch the first season again and really see if it holds up, because I did try to watch one episode of the second season. And I remember when I watched it, I just thought it was so weak. I remember thinking that, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'll have to watch season 2 now that I've seen season 1 again, but it felt like it was actually nostalgia bait. And that's something I want to talk about with season 1. One of the coolest things about this show was that a lot of people were saying before I watched this that it was nostalgia bait. I heard that a lot. And I guess for some reason it was like, is it really? And I watched it, and I remember being kind of blown away by the fact that the show managed to be an homage to 80s films like this. 80s films were like 80s, like a group of kids goes off and does something. Think like the Goonies, or would Gremlins be a good example too? Maybe. It, I guess, is 90, but stuff like that, and 80s horror films. And it manages to do that without being nostalgia bait. Like, it just sets itself in the 80s and makes sense to be in the 80s, but it's not constantly making note of the fact that it's in the 80s. It just does. It has a kind of style that suggests, look, this is in it enhances the setting. To be clear, I mean that the show is designed so that certain aspects of it look as though and sound as though they were actually made in the 80s, so that this story could have been a film that came out in the 80s. That's kind of the presentation here. And that actually enhances the setting as opposed to just constantly calling attention to itself. At least in theory, anyway. And that's something that I think is really cool about Stranger Things, that it really does stand up completely on its own, even though it is calling back to another era. And it's doing that for a good reason. So I think that's cool, because we have been in a decade of 80s nostalgia bait, like 100%. That's like been the thing, and 90s to a certain extent. And so when something like this gets huge, you get cynical, I guess. But I would say that this does feel pretty legitimate on its own. So I'll just toss that point aside right at the beginning. Okay, so I think I mentioned Stranger Things in the Get Recc'd episode where we talked about Westworld, where I gave my little diatribe about how I think live-action shows tend to be really generic and don't give a fuck about the presentation so long as the story is good. And I want to make it clear now, as I hope I made it clear then, that I'm not an expert on this subject. It's just that when I talk to people who do watch a lot of television, they don't even disagree with me. And so it seems to me that I'm probably right, although I'm sure there are other examples. And I remember, I think I brought up Stranger Things as a counterexample, saying that Stranger Things actually did give itself interesting presentation, and that's why I had thought that I loved it so much. So I guess the theme talking about this, and I will say all of my thoughts, including ones that carry over from my first viewing, but I was disappointed rewatching this, to be honest. Because I feel like it actually doesn't really have the presentation I thought it did. I feel like it kind of tricked me into thinking that it did. Because rewatching it really doesn't. And what I mean by this is, like, the intro to this show, this seems irrelevant, but it's really not. The intro to this show is one of the coolest fucking things I've ever seen. We can both agree on that, right? Like, the intro sequence here. At the start of every episode, the Stranger Things logo, right? It's incredible. Like the synth swell, the soundtrack here, and then the way the letters come in, and the way they put so much attention to detail that, like, when the credits fade in and fade out, they have a little bit of red behind them, to replicate the way that 80s films that did like text fade-ins and fade-outs looked, because they were literally using sliders, and that's just an effect that was caused as a result of that. So they had that much attention to detail to make it look like some kind of retro camera style, something that actually could have been made in the 80s. And yet the show itself doesn't actually do that. Like, it just looks like a television show for the most part. Occasionally they have a little bit of attention, like when the kids are riding bikes and things like that. They definitely make an effort to make it look like it's shot in a way that these old films were shot, but most of the time they really aren't putting the focus on that. I would say that shot composition, shot to shot editing, lighting, everything like that just looks like a TV show that would have come out at the time this came out. And even the soundtrack, which is one of the ways that I think the show did something cool, was it made a soundtrack using synths and basically anything that would have been available to 80s filmmakers. Even then, it sometimes just forgets about that. Like, there's a section where they play David Bowie's Heroes, but it's one of those fucking slow trailer versions of it where it's like synth, like string swells and a different singer, and it's slower and it's eerie, and it's like, this is not following the theme you set up for your show. And all the little stuff like that really bugged me, because sometimes the show did actually put a lot of care, and the editing put a lot of care into replicating that, like using songs that were available at that time and things like that. And other times it just didn't. There were other scenes where there was like orchestral score that, I mean, sure, it could have been made in the 80s, but it sounds like stuff that you hear in like Marvel films and shit, you know? And that was probably my biggest disappointment going back to this. Even visual effects, and I understand a lot of this can be chalked up to budget, but even visual effects, they went with really bad, cheap CG as opposed to physical or practical effects or claymation or something. So using things that were not available to filmmakers at this time, and it ended up making the show look a lot worse. I guess we'll get into that too. And that stuff bugged me on this most recent viewing. And that's what I want to say before we put the spoiler tag up. Steven, I'll let you comment, I guess.
How do you feel about the film grain?
I almost felt like there wasn't enough. That's something I wanted to say. You know what could have been cool? And maybe this was out of their reach or something, and maybe it wouldn't have worked. But I was thinking while watching this, what if they shot this with film cameras from the time, if they could get their hands on them? Or something like that, just so that when you watch the film, it looked like an 80s movie in like every way. They did not do that. And I kind of feel like that could have been another little thing that could have also kind of enhanced it, but, you know, maybe it's not huge.
Yeah, for the most part, I understand the criticism, but I also think it's in some way that would almost continue to bring forward the conversation of what you mentioned prior, which is that people thought that this series was kind of pandering to the whole 80s vibe. So the harder you lean into it, I think the harder it is to escape that. Right? So in some of these situations, it's like I like the subtlety and I like the nods, but also I appreciate that it's still brought to kind of the modern, some of the modern sensibilities. Now, Lewis, what do you think? I feel like, and I don't know entirely if it happens so much in season 1 as I know it does in the later seasons, but there are some very cool shots across this thing. I'm thinking about some of the scenes, I think in season 1 where they're using Jonathan and his camera to kind of capture some of the moments at the party and some of those wider shots, but then kind of the zoom in from the focus of the camera. Thinking some of the things obviously they do with the upside down, which isn't necessarily crazy. They literally take the camera and turn it upside down.
Yeah.
But some of those things are kind of interesting. I don't know how you feel about those.
There were cool shots occasionally. I mentioned the bicycle riding stuff because I think that's actually one of the ways in which the show's been mostly influential. I remember seeing it and I was like, this is just Stranger Things. Because I guess Stranger Things is just doing things other things had done before, but still, like, following the bicycles with tracking shots and cool stuff like that. There are some pretty cool cinematic shots every now and again, but they're few and far between, at least in this season. I don't know how that changes in the next season. I mean, the cinematography is acceptable. It's fine. There are some shots that were kind of shitty when it came to, like, shot, reverse shot kind of stuff, which a lot of these shows tend to have kind of shitty shots when it comes to shot, reverse shot. But for the most part, it was serviceable, and occasionally it went above and beyond. There was one shot where they actually played with the aspect ratio and had the widescreen start to come in, the black bars start to come in on the screen, and I was like, whoa, that's actually really cool. That only happened once, that I noticed anyway. Real quick, and I will get into spoiler territory sooner rather than later, so we can talk about all the other stuff. But real quick, I wanted to rebut what you said, because I actually disagree that if they went more into making this look like an 80s film, that it would have lend credence to the nostalgia bait criticism. Because I see what you're saying, but this is kind of my issue with that criticism in the first place, was that I feel like, to me, nostalgia bait is like, look, here's a Rubik's Cube. Look, here's, there's an Evil Dead poster in this. What if Jonathan gets up to the Evil Dead poster and says, like, man, I love the Evil Dead. I love, I'm forgetting the director's name. Shit, that's really bad.
George Romero?
No, not George Romero. Sam Raimi, right? Right? Shit. The fuck? I don't want to get this wrong. Hold on.
No, isn't Sam Raimi?
It's not George Romero. It's Sam Raimi. Yeah, Evil Dead. Sam Raimi. Just looked it up. Yeah. Same guy who did the Spider-Man movies. Or right. Stuff like that. Like, it could have really shoved this in your face, and it did not do that. Like, yeah, they're playing Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, that's just because that's what kids did. It wasn't like, whoa, Dungeons and Dragons, and all this kind of stuff. It was just there because that was the setting. And, the presentation of that setting, at least the idea of what they were trying to do, like with the intro sequence, for example, was only in service of the setting. It wasn't in service of anything else. It wasn't to say, remember the 80s? It was, this is a show that is set in the 80s, and it's got a premise that is very similar to 80s films, so we're going to make it look like those 80s films so that it can kind of draw you into that setting more. And the thing is, even if it would lend more credence to the nostalgia bait criticism, it doesn't really matter anyway, because this show still set itself up to have this presentation, yet failed to deliver it. So even if you have that criticism, that it's nostalgia bait, it doesn't really matter to what I'm saying, because what bothers me is that they set the scene for that, but they didn't go all the way through with it. Like, that intro sequence is very, very clearly designed to look like it was made in the 80s, and it's done really well. The score was designed to make it sound like it came out of the 80s, usually anyway. But then they break it every now and again, and that's what bothers me. It's like, if you're going to do that, then actually do it. But they don't commit. And so...
But I guess philosophically, there can be a distinction, I think, between atmosphere and location and set dressing and presentation.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because, I don't think this thing needs to be 100% accurate to how an 80s film or an 80s show of this type would be presented to still be able to have a show that's very well set and atmospherically influenced by the 80s. Because I will 100% agree with you. This show does an immaculate job, and not just the first season. I think even going into later season. Even into some situations where I feel like you could point and say, this is clearly just a very not so subtle nod. Like in the second season, it takes place in October, and the kids dress up as the Ghostbusters. But the thing is, and you mentioned it, right? It's like, at that time, Ghostbusters would have been the biggest film, and everyone would have dressed up as the Ghostbusters. So it's not like they're saying, hey, look, Ghostbusters, you guys remember that? It's like, no, because of the situation and the time and the place, that is just what these kids do.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of things atmospherically and setting wise that they really take very meticulous care to impart within the show. But I don't necessarily think that means that every aspect of the show has to be 80s.
So I understand that. It's just, if that's the point, then almost take that up with the directors, I would say, because they obviously wanted to do that. They just didn't do it. Why then would they set up an intro sequence that looks like it was out of the 80s? Why then would they decide to make their score comprised of synths and drum kits? There's no reason to do that unless you want to conjure up certain imagery. Like when you listen to the synth, you say, oh wow, that kind of reminds me of 80s horror films. and things like that. Like, why would you then do so much to draw up that imagery and set the show up as though that's kind of what it is, but then not go all the way? Like, that's kind of my point, right? Like, yeah, you're right. It would have been perfectly fine to set the show in the 80s and not do all this presentation stuff. I wouldn't have even asked for it. Like, I was just talking about it. It's a good example because that movie set itself in that time frame, but it didn't present itself like an 80s film, and that was fine. It was just like, that's just what it was. But Stranger Things is like conflicted. It's like caught between two worlds. It's like it wants to do that, and I feel personally,
you can almost say there's like a right side up and an upside down.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, like, it's like if and in my opinion, if it did go all the way with that presentation, I think it would have actually enhanced the mood a lot. Maybe other people will disagree, I guess, but it just seems to me that having it look and sound at times just like any other TV show can take away from it, especially when it gives me expectations for something else, I guess is all I'm saying. But I mean, I understand why it wouldn't bother other people as well. I want to get into spoilers because I want to actually talk about the story now that I've gotten all that out of the way, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So I was disappointed, but I wasn't disappointed because I suddenly thought the show was bad or anything like that. Like, I still think this show is fucking cool. Like, this is a good show. And it's just like, when you rewatch something, one of the things, and you really, that you really liked, one of the things that's really cool is that when you rewatch it, you can notice all the little things that make you appreciate it more, right? Whereas this time, all the stuff I already knew I loved, like the story and the setting, and the characters and the performances, was all the same. I remembered it. But all the stuff I thought I loved, all the little stuff that I thought I would get more of at a second viewing, was actually worse than I remembered. So that's why I was disappointed. But enough about the disappointment angle, because I do like this show. So now that we're into spoiler territory, the entire concept here of the group of kids, the teenagers, the cops who don't believe them, a whole nother crazy world of monsters coming to kill everyone, all this kind of stuff is like so riddled in 80s cliche that it is almost the level where it's like, this is just super derivative. But what the show does that is so cool, story-wise, is that it takes most of these cliches, not all of them, but most of these cliches, and subverts them, not to make a commentary on them necessarily, but just to ensure that this show is different. The cop who doesn't believe them ends up actually teaming up with them and being one of the members of their team. There's a bully, kind of a douchebag who's the boyfriend of Barbara. Is that her right? Yes. Nancy. Sorry. I always get him confused. Nancy. He's the boyfriend of Nancy, and then she meets this like kind of creepier, nerdier, loser type guy, and it sets it up that she's gonna fall for him, but she actually. They don't do that shit where it's like, oh, I'm gonna actually fall for the nerdy guy after all. In the end, she's still with the douchebag guy, and all that kind of stuff. It's like, it's little.
At least for this season.
Oh fuck. Well, anyway, the point is, like, that was what was cool about this, is it was like, it was actually different, so that not only was its story kind of different, it wasn't exactly the story of another show, of another film like it, but it also had character interactions that were different as well, that weren't just completely riddled in cliches, and it intentionally made you believe that it was going to be riddled in cliches, just so it could be like, no, we're not going to do that, which is something that I liked about it.
Yeah, the characterization, the performances, you mentioned them already, but every one of these characters is so strong and so unique and so fun to follow. And they don't necessarily all have their subplots. All of their character lines are connected into the main story, but you get good little snippets of each of the characters. Enough screen time to where you can kind of understand their motivation and who they are. And just in general, now that we have spoiler tag up, I mean, there are some really great moments in this season. Even one on the poster is alluded to with the Christmas wall light. Like, that is just such a cool concept,
yeah,
and so well executed. And in general, Winona Ryder's performance, not only in this season but across all the seasons, this like crazy mom,
it's stellar.
She does such a good job, and I don't even think she's acting, honestly. I kind of think that's how she is. I don't know if you've ever seen when they won an award and she's on stage just making these like insane faces out of nowhere.
I've seen her in Alien Resurrection, and in Alien Resurrection, she looks exactly like she looks through the entire. Except it makes a lot less sense there. But in that sense, it was great casting. You know, I remember a lot of people saying at the time that, or maybe not a lot of people. I don't remember who it was, but there was at least one critic I remember on YouTube or something. Was it Red Letter Media? It might have been, but somebody was like saying that like her performance was overrated or whatever because the whole time she's just making this dumb face and it's like, yeah, but like but it's convincing. Like, she looks like a fucking mom who's worried that who knows that her son is in some alternate universe and nobody believes her, and she's kind of going mad, but she's also not going mad. I mean, if Winona Ryder really does just look like this all the time, then they cast her really, really well, because she really is the best performance in this entire show. I think we could probably both agree on that. Like, she's just incredible, and like you really believe that she is a mom who is a particularly strong character. But like, of course, she's nervous all the time. Like, duh. You know, it seemed like a weird criticism to say like that she always looks worried. Like, well, yeah, that makes sense.
That's not to take away from all the other actors here, because the child actors are really good in this season, and they are quite young in this season too.
Yeah.
David Harbour, who is Hopper, the cop, he's really great and only gets better. And that's the other thing I'll mention is, even going past this season, I feel like each of these characters only gets stronger, which is a really, which is just a kudos to the writing team on this show.
Yeah, and already like character dynamics are great. I wanted to you mentioned the kids, and I think like the dynamics that the kids actually have is just fantastic. And it's the same thing that inspired like It, which some of the kids in this are in that too. But it's like they feel like real kids, and their performances are pretty good, you know? Like, they give convincing performances, and also, even though they're kind of on the outskirts of the plot here, like, they almost end up being the focus, because it's like you just enjoy their interactions that much, and you believe that they would actually go out of their way to search for their friend too. Like, even though a lot of the characters act in a way that seems almost kind of irrational, it's like they're all characterized so well that you just generally believe it all.
So, Lewis, what do you think about, I guess, just the mainline thread of this first season? You know, the idea of the Upside Down and the big Demogorgon monster.
I like it a lot because it leaves itself open to so much mystery, where the rules can be fantastical, but they can make sense. So if we assume that there's like another realm, there's an upside down world, because really at the core this is a monster movie, this first season. But because they give that monster very few limitations, it makes it a lot more tense. Like, you can have these sequences where, yeah, she's talking to her son through lights, and you know that the lights are affected. And it's just like, it adds that extra element of mystery. I think there's already kind of the element of mystery with the whole government conspiracy thing going on. But the fact that you know so little about the Upside Down and the way that world works is probably for the best. I don't know how much they explore it later, but I assume it's the kind of thing that if you get into it too much, it might get kind of absurd. And if you're going to have a monster movie like this, I like the sci-fi angle a lot. My one biggest issue, though, with it is that I mentioned how the rules are kind of up in the air, and that's kind of a good thing sometimes, but I don't know. Like, the show could have been a little bit better in establishing how the creature travels from world to world. Like, I understand like there are like rips that occur between the two dimensions because it got out because of L. Like, I understand that, but there are scenes where there's one scene where it pulls a deer into the Upside Down and eats it, and Nancy and Jonathan see the deer get pulled away in the real world, but there's nothing grabbing it; it just like flies away. But then in other scenes, the monster does actually show up and influences the world like in its true form. And I'm like, okay, so then why is it sometimes invisible and other times not? Like, how does that work? The film actually the show, I guess it speaks good to it that it made me feel like it's a film. That's kind of what it wants to do, but it could have done a better job of honestly, something as simple as just an arm reaching and grabbing the deer would have been enough, because you would know, oh shit, like it can come out from anywhere. But I don't know, having it where it can like affect things in the real world, being invisible, is just odd, and it kind of really it doesn't make the show as tense, because you don't know exactly what you can and can't do, and so you just, I don't know, it just kind of loses something.
Yep. And I agree. I think that what's nice about the first season is there's an air of mystery. Not too much is necessarily dived into too deeply, but just enough for you to kind of understand this world's rules and boundaries and why this happened and what's going on. But for the most part, the plot line for this first season is very simple. There is a monster. The monster is bad. Their friend is missing. They want to resolve that. And that's about as kind of deep as the like mainline plot goes, really.
Yeah.
Which is good, because it's a good foundation for something that now it's on its third season.
Yeah, and having Elle, I like Elle a lot. I think she has a lot of really badass scenes. Having a character who can flip cars and shit is just cool. Like, it's just cool. And they do a lot of cool things with it. And this is where I wanted to bring something up. I mentioned that for the most part, it breaks all of the cliches. The one cliche it doesn't break is the bully kids who bully the losers and then get their comeuppance in the end. This goes exactly as you'd expect it to. But I don't even care, because of the scene where Elle breaks the kid's arm is just so rad and so satisfying. It like doesn't even matter, which I guess speaks to just how cool Elle is and how good of a job they did with her, that I didn't end up caring about a bully plot line. Like, that usually bothers me a lot, but I don't know, the conclusion to that was very satisfying.
Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to mention, Lewis, I don't know if you have any other...
There are little things, but I'll take the spoiler tag down in a second, so...
Okay. So the last big thing I wanted to mention is that, and this is just kind of a commentary on the show as a whole, not just the first season, but I will just continue to say what this show does so well is it takes these characters and puts them in these situations, and that, I think we already mentioned it before, those nods to that atmosphere and the place setting, all of that is done superbly. The characterization just continues to get better. These characters grow in a way that's interesting across the multiple seasons, and you continue to get to know them. And the other thing is, and it doesn't really pop up as much in this season as it does in the next few, but even to the level of the side characters, the minor characters, it really and very quickly establishes who those characters are, makes you understand their motivation and what their identity is, and makes you fall in love with even the smallest characters that aren't the main characters. And that's why I think I enjoy this show as much as I do. Okay,
yeah. I'm going to take the spoiler tag down real quick. There's something I forgot to mention. I'll just mention it briefly, I guess. It's another negative thing. Something that I noticed on this rewatch. The show's editing is pretty bad. Like, this is like a big deal for me, actually, watching through it again. It gets better in the last few episodes where I think it really counts. But, like, a lot of the stuff before that, I remember noticing, like, a lot of, like, missed continuity between shots. Like, a lot. Not, like, to the point where it wasn't even getting nitpicky. Like, there would be shots where somebody would, like, I remember one in particular. I think it was, I don't remember the guy's name, but the old husband of Joyce rests his hand on her back, and then in the next shot, his hand's not on her back. And it was just stuff like that, like, all the time that I was noticing a lot. Sometimes even, like, dialogue would get cut up between two shots, and you'd realize that they were saying two different, like, there were two different lines. I mean, it was the same line, but two different takes, and it was, like, really jarring. Also, the color correcting in certain scenes was really bad. There were some scenes where, like, shot to shot, the color correction would be different. There were some scenes where the lighting was too dark, like when people were, like, outside and it was even daytime. The one that I really remember was when Hopper beats up the guy he meets at the bar. The lighting was terrible. And also, this is something you might have noticed that you might agree with me on, because I know a lot of people are saying this. and again, it's just a budgetary thing, I understand, but the visual effects in this are really terrible, right? Like, that's like, the monster looks terrible. And anyway, but I guess, like, that was probably my biggest disappointment coming back. Even though I think the story and performances and all that stuff's really, really good, there was a lot of stuff, visuals and editing wise and presentation wise, that again were just like really, really turning me off here, sadly. And yeah, I guess that's my last thought before I give my final thoughts, if we're good on that.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so with all that said, like, I still like this show. I'd be willing to watch 2 and 3. They're not season 2 and 3. They're 2 and 3, because I guess that's just how it rolls. But I'd probably be willing to, because I think the storyline, the characters, the performances are all really good. Particularly the performances. I think that's what made a lot of people fall in love with this, was that, like, even the kid characters were pretty compelling. And a lot of these actors, some of those child actors in particular, have gone on to be in a lot of things outside of this because they just caught on that much. And all that stuff is still great, maybe even fantastic, in terms of kind of replicating but also doing its own thing in relation to 80s adventure horror films like this. But yeah, I don't know. I have a lot of reservations on the second viewing. Again, bad editing sometimes, actually a decent amount of the time. I think a lot of missed potential in the presentation here that I think the show hints at but doesn't actually go through with, and a lot of things like that bug me a lot. So I guess it kind of calls back to what I said about Westworld as well. In some ways, I kind of would echo those thoughts here. But overall, I'm going to give it a 7, season 1 anyway. And I would say, yeah, I'd probably recommend it. I mean, if you can get me to enjoy and get invested in a show like this, I think that says something. So yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's everything.
And I can usually put those visual comments that you noted aside. I think I mentioned it in Westworld too. I guess maybe just because I'm so much more used to TV than film, that a lot of the times even the smallest upgrade in quality on some of the things like presentation are like, oh wow, this is really moving the genre forward.
Yeah.
Even though it's like still years behind. The editing note is actually an interesting note, because I don't even know if even in my rewatch, I noticed any of those things. So that's something I'd have to go back and maybe skim through and see if I notice as well. But to your point on some of the lighting, I definitely agree, especially color correction in the school, like in the very final scenes in the school. I feel like a lot of that time it just kind of looked a little bit like muddled garbage. But it is what it is. Sometimes you have to do that, especially because their CG budget, as you noted, probably is not as good as it was, and that monster doesn't really look that great. So the darker you make it, the better it looks, those sorts of things. But in general, I really, really enjoyed this show. I've enjoyed the show for all the seasons that I've watched. I think that this season is still probably my favorite season, I would say, followed by maybe 3 and then 2. So that I give Stranger Things season 1 as high as a 9. I really enjoy this show and this season particularly. I just think that there are a lot of great concepts and ideas here, even though a lot of it is homage. As you mentioned, it still kind of stands up as its own thing. And I would definitely recommend, the one nice thing about Netflix shows is, one, they're all there so you can binge them pretty easily. And I think this season's like 8 episodes. So not as long as a traditional television series. So again, pretty easy to binge through and watch. And I don't think we mentioned it, but I will mention as well, it never overstays its welcome, which is really good. And I think if it were to be longer, which actually happens in season 2, it might overstay its welcome. So it's nice that it's like a kind of a breezy 8 episodes, really wraps itself up very well. Doesn't have too much fluff, mainly sticks to the main points, which is good.
Okay, so I think we're going on to the recommendations now.
Yes.
Okay, well, I'll go first. Steven, I'm going to recommend to you a first for Get Recc'd, I'm pretty sure. I'm going to recommend to you a documentary. The documentary is called Into the Abyss. It is a documentary by... what's his name? Hold on. I should have known this going in. It's a documentary by Werner Herzog.
Werner Herzog.
Yeah, Werner Herzog, and it is about a death row inmate Michael Perry and his accomplice Jason Burkett from a triple homicide in Texas, and that's probably all I'm going to say about it. That'll be interesting to talk about a documentary. I haven't done that before. Yeah, that's my rec. What's yours?
Okay, Lewis, I am going to recommend to you another game. Kind of backloading these things. We've pushed games off to the side because they're a little harder to recommend usually because of time constraints. But I'm going to recommend to you a game. It is a game that was largely developed by one person who really going into it had no experience in game design or art or music and did all of them for this. That game is Undertale by Toby Fox. Undertale came out a few years ago now. It's kind of in the public mainstream again because Sans from Undertale just made his way into Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, much to the surprise of many. But we're going to talk about the meme lord Toby Fox next time with Undertale.
Okay, great. I guess that does it for this episode. As always, we'd probably like to say that we are on Castbox. The link to that will be in the description. I think I forgot to put last episode up, but it'll be up soon. And you can listen to Get Recc'd on your mobile device in the car or whatever. So that's cool. Do you have anything else to say? I don't think so.
In the shower, while you're voting, at your Gatsby party. Any of those places.
I thought you were saying in the shower while you're voting.
Yeah,
which would be odd, but
hey, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, true.
Instead of putting on Skrillex in your nightclub next time, put on Get Recc'd. It'll be a good time.
Yeah, Get Recc'd Zed remix.
Yeah, everyone will get down to the Zed remix of Get Recc'd.
Yeah, pretty cool.
Well, it'll be Get Recc'd, but there'll be 2 Ds this time for Zed, his remix.
Okay, so do you have anything else you wanted to say, or are we done?
No, I think we're done.
Well, with that, those were our thoughts. Those were our recommendations. Get Recc'd.